The morning she turned 20, Marisol Vega woke up to the sound of her suitcase being dragged across the hallway floor. She did not need to open her eyes to understand what was happening. She had felt it coming, the way you feel a storm before the sky changes color. In the pressure, in the silence at dinner, in the way her stepmother had stopped saying her name and started calling her the girl when speaking to Marisol's father within earshot. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she had occupied for 6 years, counting the water stain in the corner that had grown and shifted like a continent over time. Outside the window, the neighborhood of Corrales, New Mexico was just beginning to breathe, sprinklers stuttering to life in the pale blue light, a rooster somewhere past the back fence doing his indifferent duty. She dressed without hurrying. She had learned early that rushing gave other people the satisfaction of watching you scramble. She folded what she could. She left behind what she had to. When she came downstairs with her single bag, her father was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, not looking at her. Her stepmother, Diane, stood at the counter in a silk robe the color of old cream, her posture announcing what her face refused to commit to. Triumph held just slightly behind the surface. "There's an envelope on the counter," Diane said, gesturing with her chin. "It should cover a few weeks." Marisol did not touch the envelope. She looked at her father instead, giving him the full weight of her gaze, done the way her grandfather had taught her. Never let them think you were ashamed of seeing the truth plainly. Her father did not look up. He turned the mug in his hands with the slow rotation of a man trying to appear thoughtful, when in fact he had already thought everything through and decided he would live with it. She picked up the envelope on her way out. Not because she needed the permission of their money, because she had earned it. 6 years of quiet usefulness in their house, of cooking meals that went unacknowledged, of working the small catering company her father owned on weekends for wages that never quite materialized into her own account. She stepped outside into the mild February air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The street was ordinary, persistent, indifferent. A dog barked somewhere far enough away that it felt decorative. She had $43 of her own, the $200 in the envelope, a change of clothes, and a phone with 17% battery. She was 20 years old, and the world had the particular quality of wide open that looks, from the outside, like freedom, but feels, from the inside, like a room with no furniture. She spent 3 weeks in Albuquerque couch surfing among the friends who were still willing, waiting tables at a place on Central Avenue that smelled of old grease and ambition, saving everything she could. She was good at survival in the practical sense. She did not waste money on comfort. She did not waste energy on self-pity, at least not visibly. At night sometimes, when the apartment was quiet and her friend's cat had taken up its position on the foot of the pullout, she allowed herself 10 minutes. She set an internal timer, like her grandfather had told her to do, when grief was necessary, but inconvenient. 10 minutes, he had said. Feel everything you need to feel. Then fold it up, put it somewhere you can reach, and get back to the work of living. Her grandfather, Ernesto Vega, the one person in the genealogy of her life who had loved her without conditions or caveats. He had died 14 months earlier, and she had not been told about it until the day after the funeral. Her stepmother had fielded the call, decided the timing was inconvenient, and noted it in a small way that made it seem like a scheduling conflict. Marisol had found out from a cousin's Facebook post, when she had gone into the bathroom at the catering job and sat on the floor for 17 minutes, 7 over her allotted time, before she could stand back up. She had never been able to forgive herself that she had not held his hand when it mattered. Ernesto Vega had been many things. He had been a man of small physical stature who took up enormous emotional space. He had been a veteran of nothing glamorous, a worker of unglamorous things, grains and copper and earth. He had built his distillery in Mora County, New Mexico in 1971, on land that had been in the Vega family since before statehood. The distillery had operated for almost 30 years, making small-batch rye whiskey and a green chili spirit he had invented himself that food writers from Santa Fe occasionally made the drive to describe. And he had been proud in the specific way of people who build things with their hands, quietly, specifically, without needing anyone else to confirm the value of what they had made. The distillery had gone quiet around 2002. His wife, Marisol's grandmother, had died that winter, and the grief had settled on him like weather that forgets to leave. He had boarded the windows and locked the mash room and told no one why. By the time Marisol was old enough to ask questions, he had moved into the smaller house on the property, and the distillery building itself had become a permanent fixture of the landscape. Large, weathered, its tin roof rusting at the seams, its sign half legible from the road. People assumed he had simply run out of reasons to keep going. People assumed many things about Ernesto Vega that were close enough to true that they stopped looking for what was accurate. She had spent summers on that property between the ages of 7 and 14. She knew the smell of the land in July, dry juniper, and the faint mineral sweetness that came up from the creek on the east side when the afternoon storms rolled in from the mountains. She knew the way the light hit the tin roof at exactly 4 in the afternoon and turned the whole building the color of an old penny. She knew her grandfather's hands, which were large for a man of his height and were always warm, even in winter. She knew that he sang to himself when he thought no one could hear. Old corridos, in a voice that had no pretensions about its limitations, but carried the melody faithfully anyway. And she had loved that property the way children love places that hold no judgment, instinctively, completely, without the need to articulate why. It was in that third week in Albuquerque, on a Tuesday evening, when the restaurant had been slow, and she had too much quiet and too little sleep, that the call came. The attorney's name was Gabriel Reyes, and he spoke with the careful cadence of someone who had delivered complicated news many times and understood that simplicity was a form of mercy. He explained that Ernesto Vega's estate had been in probate for 14 months. He explained that there had been a challenge from one branch of the family, her uncle Rodrigo and his wife, who had argued that Ernesto had not been of clear mind when he wrote his final will. He explained that the challenge had failed, and then he said the words that Marisol had to ask him to repeat because she was certain she had misheard them. The property was hers. The distillery, the smaller house, the 7 acres of land, the water rights along the creek, the equipment inside. All of it had been left to her, specifically, by name. He amended the will 2 years before he died, Gabriel Reyes said. He knew you specifically. He wrote your name 3 times in the document. I have never seen that before. A name written 3 times. He wanted there to be no ambiguity. Marisol sat down on the edge of the pull-out sofa and looked at the cat, which looked back at her with the specific boredom of a creature that has no context for human milestones. "Does my uncle know?" she asked. "He does," Gabriel said. "He's not happy. But the law is clear." She drove to Mora County 2 days later in a borrowed car that burned oil and complained about hills. The drive took nearly 3 hours from Albuquerque, north on 25, then east through the mountains where the highway narrowed and the pines pressed in close, and the air changed in a way you felt in your chest before you noticed it in your lungs. She had made this drive 100 times as a child, always with the specific anticipation of arrival that belonged only to places that held people you loved. This time, the anticipation was different, heavier. The property appeared around a curve in the county road, the way she had always remembered it, suddenly, as if the land decided to reveal it all at once rather than gradually. The smaller house her grandfather had lived in was set back from the road, its portal casting the familiar band of shade across the front. The garden was overgrown, but not dead. The large cottonwood at the corner of the property still stood with the particular authority of old trees that have witnessed more than they could be asked to explain. And the distillery building, the Vega Distillery, as the faded sign still insisted, stood where it had always stood, at the back of the property, large and deliberate, its boarded windows like eyes that had decided to stop looking out. She sat in the car for a long time before getting out. She did not know exactly what she was feeling. It was layered. Grief for the grandfather she had not been allowed to say goodbye to. Gratitude that felt almost guilty in its intensity. A specific longing for the version of herself that had run across that yard at the age of 9 without the weight of anything complicated. And beneath all of that, something quieter and more insistent. The sense that this place had waited for her, that the waiting had been intentional. She stepped out into the February cold, and the land received her the way it always had, without ceremony, without judgment, exactly the way her grandfather would have wanted. The keys Gabriel Reyes had mailed her opened the house first. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dried herbs and the particular quality of a space that had been cared for and then carefully closed, not abandoned, but paused. Her grandfather's things were exactly where he had left them. A denim jacket hung by the door. His boots stood by the wood stove, one slightly ahead of the other, as if he had just stepped out of them moments ago. On the kitchen table, weighted down by a small stone that Marisol recognized as one she had given him from the creek when she was 8, was an envelope. Her name was on it in his handwriting. The sight of it undid something she had been holding together since the attorney's call. She sat down at the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed through the first wave of it. Then she opened the envelope. He had written 3 pages in the close, deliberate script of a man who had learned penmanship when it was considered a form of respect. He wrote that he was sorry she was not there when he died, and that this was not her fault, but the fault of circumstances he had understood too late to correct. He wrote that he had left her the property because she was the only one in the family who had ever asked him real questions, not about money or practicality, but about the work, about why he had chosen rye over wheat, about what the green chili spirit had meant to him, about what the building had felt like when it was running at full capacity on a winter morning, steam rising from the mash room and the smell of grain filling everything. He wrote that she had a mind for things that mattered, and that the world had not been kind enough to her yet, but that the world sometimes corrected itself if you gave it long enough. And then, in the final paragraph, he wrote something that she read 3 times before the meaning settled. The distillery is not empty, Misha. I never stopped working. I just stopped letting anyone watch. She folded the letter and held it against her chest. Then she put on her jacket, took the set of keys from the envelope, and walked across the yard toward the boarded building in the back. The distillery building was larger than it appeared from the road. She had forgotten that, the way you forget scale when you remember a place primarily through the emotional register of childhood. The structure was 2 stories at the center, with lower attached wings on each side, all of it clad in weathered wood siding that had once been painted a deep red and had since gone the color of dried blood, and then beyond that, to a kind of dignified gray. The windows were boarded with plywood that had warped at the edges from years of freeze and thaw, since the main entrance was secured with a padlock that looked newer than everything else around it. She tried keys until the right one turned. The interior smell hit her first, grain and char, and something underneath both of those that she could not name, but recognized instantly as the specific smell of her grandfather's work. The smell of a building that had been alive with a particular kind of purpose, and had not entirely forgotten it. The main room was dim, light filtering through the gaps in the boards. She could see the outlines of equipment, large copper stills that rose toward the ceiling like sculptures made functional, their surfaces dark with oxidation, but intact, their rivets and seams still holding. Mash tuns stood in a row along one wall, fermentation vessels, ancient but solid, but the infrastructure of making something from grain and water and time. She moved through the space slowly, running her hand along surfaces, letting her eyes adjust. Her grandfather's presence was everywhere, in the arrangement of tools on the wall hooks, in the handwritten labels still affixed to valves and gauges, in the small cot in the corner of the main room that she had not expected to find, suggesting that he had spent time here that was not casual. At the far end of the main room, a door led to what she remembered had been called the mash room, the heart of the operation, where grain was cooked and converted before fermentation. The door was heavier than the others, fitted with 2 locks instead of 1, both of which accepted the same key with a deliberateness that suggested they had been installed together, intentionally, or at the same time. She pushed the door open. The mash room was larger than the rest of the building had prepared her for. It extended back farther than the exterior dimensions should have allowed, a discrepancy she filed away without yet understanding. The floor was stone, original, she thought, or close to it, and her footsteps landed on it, with a solidity that resonated up through her legs. Along the right wall were the large mash tuns she expected. Along the left wall was something she did not. Shelving, floor to ceiling, 12 feet high, running the entire length of the room, perhaps 60 feet of shelving, and on every shelf, in orderly, labeled rows, cases upon cases of whiskey, not bottles in the casual sense. Cases. Wooden cases, wax sealed, each one bearing a small handwritten tag in her grandfather's script. She stepped closer and read the nearest tag. Vega Reserve. Rye. Barrel number 7. Distilled 1987. Aged 23 years. She read the next one. Vega Reserve. Green chili. Barrel number 2. Distilled 1999. Aged 10 years. The dates went back further than she had understood his operation to have continued. She read tags from 1978, from 1983, from 1991. She read labels for spirits she had not known he had ever produced. A single malt aged in Madeira casks, a corn whiskey finished in cherry wood, a botanical spirit with a list of ingredients that read like a map of the high desert. He had not stopped making whiskey when the distillery went quiet. He had stopped selling it. He had spent 20 years producing, aging, cataloging, and carefully storing what he made, here in this room, on behind locked doors that no one had thought to look behind, because the building appeared closed and the man appeared finished. She stood in the center of the mash room, surrounded by the shelves, and felt the room rearranging something inside her. The scale of it was not immediately calculable. She counted cases by row, losing track, starting over. There were hundreds, perhaps more, and the oldest of them, bottles aged 30, 35, close to 40 years. Those were not bottles of ordinary whiskey. Age did things to spirits the way it did things to certain people. It deepened them. It made them rarer. It made them worth more than the math of production could ever have predicted. She did not know the exact numbers yet. She did not know what a case of 40-year Vega rye might sell for at auction, or what a distillery with this inventory and this provenance might be worth to someone who understood the market for American whiskey, the way the market had learned to understand it over the past decade. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew, standing there in the cold and the dim and the particular smell of grain and time, was that her grandfather hadn't been broken when he closed the windows. He had been building something. He had been building it for her. For a long time she stood very still. The shelves waited with the patience of things that have already waited a very long time and are comfortable with the practice. She thought about her grandfather singing in the kitchen. She thought about his hands, which were always warm. No, she thought about the suitcase being dragged across the hallway floor on the morning of her 20th birthday, and the $200 in the envelope, and the 17 minutes she had spent on the bathroom floor when she learned he was gone. She thought about the 3 times he had written her name in the will, and what it meant that he had done that, and whether he had known, the way people who love you sometimes simply know, how much the certainty of being specifically chosen would matter to a girl who had spent the last 6 years being generally tolerated. She allowed herself a longer time than 10 minutes. Her grandfather, she thought, would have understood the exception. The first person she told was nobody. She spent 3 days on the property alone, sleeping in the small house, waking at first light, walking the land. I'm beginning to understand the scope of what existed. She needed to think before she needed to talk, and she had learned early that thinking required a certain amount of quiet that other people tended to interrupt with their own feelings about your situation. On the 4th day, she called Gabriel Reyes and told him she needed to understand the legal status of the inventory, whether the estate had included any accounting of what the distillery held, whether there had been any disclosure to the probate court. Gabriel was quiet for a moment that Marisol recognized as the particular silence of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew about a case. "No," he said carefully. "The distillery was listed as a building with equipment. No specific inventory was conducted. Your uncle's attorney sent someone to photograph the exterior, but they did not have access to the interior. And if the interior holds value that was not accounted for in the probate assessment?" Gabriel was quiet again. "That's an interesting question," he said finally. "If the estate was filed based on an incomplete inventory, and the missing inventory has since been discovered by the heir, by me," Marisol said. "By you," Gabriel agreed. "Then that inventory is yours. As part of the estate, it was always part of the estate. We simply did not know it existed." There was a pause during which Marisol could hear him processing things, the kind of processing that attorneys do in real time and charge for later. "I think," Gabriel said slowly, "that you should have someone come and assess what's in there before your uncle's family has any opportunity to revisit the probate findings." "I think so too," Marisol said. She had already been thinking that for 3 days. It took her 2 weeks to arrange it. She found an independent spirits appraiser through a contact she made at a restaurant supply company in Santa Fe, a woman named Donna Whitfield, who had spent 20 years in the wine and spirits trade and now consulted for auction houses and estate attorneys and the occasional confused heir who had discovered that their grandparents had been, without announcement, building something significant. Donna arrived on a Thursday in early March, driving a truck that suggested she was not a person who had chosen her profession for its glamour. She was 61, compact, or with the specific, focused manner of someone who had learned to look at objects rather than at people, because objects told the truth more consistently. She walked into the mash room, stopped after about 4 steps, and said nothing for almost 2 minutes. Then she said, in a voice stripped of any performance, "How long has this been here?" "The oldest ones I've found were distilled in 1978, Marisol said. "He kept going after he closed the public operation." Donna walked to the nearest shelf and picked up a bottle with care, tilting it toward the light that came through the single high window. The whiskey inside moved with a viscosity that pleased her. She read the tag. She put it back. She moved to another shelf, another case, another bottle. Marisol watched her the way she had learned to watch people who were in the process of understanding something, not interrupting, not explaining, simply creating the conditions in which understanding could happen at its own pace. After perhaps 40 minutes of moving through the room in this way, Donna turned around. "Do you have any idea what American-aged whiskey is selling for at auction right now?" she said. "Some idea," Marisol said. "I've been researching." "The aged rye market in particular," Donna said. "Single estate, Small batch with continuous provenance documentation, which it looks like you have, from those tags, has gone stratospheric in the last 8 years. There's a Pappy Van Winkle comparison people make, but this is different. This is older. And some of this is older than anything currently available commercially. How much older? The 1978 rye, Donna said. If those bottles are what they appear to be, and I would need to pull samples and have them lab verified, those are 45-year rye whiskeys. There are 14 cases on that shelf. I count what appears to be 12 bottles per case. She paused, looking at Marisol with the expression of a person who wants to make sure someone is ready to receive information accurately. A single bottle of 45-year single estate American rye with documented provenance at current auction values would start, at the low end, at $18,000. Marisol did not say anything. She did the math in her head, then did it again because the first answer seemed improbable. 14 cases, 12 bottles per case, or 168 bottles, at $18,000 a bottle at the low end. And that, Donna said, reading something in Marisol's face, is just the 1978 rye. That is one shelf. This room has... She turned and looked at the shelves. How far back does this go? About 60 feet, Marisol said. Donna looked at her for a moment with an expression that moved through several things before settling on something that resembled professional awe. I'm going to need a week, she said, and a better flashlight. Word reached her Uncle Rodrigo before she was ready for it to. She did not know exactly how. She suspected Gabriel Reyes's office had a leak. Not malicious, simply the ordinary porousness of small community professional networks where everyone knew everyone and information moved the way water moved, finding its level through whatever cracks were available. Rodrigo called her on a Sunday evening. He was 3 years younger than her father, broader in physical type and narrower in temperament, a man who had made a moderate living in commercial real estate in Albuquerque and had arranged his self-image around the certainty that he was the practical one in the family, the one who understood how things actually worked. He opened with warmth that was so clearly assembled for the occasion that Marisol almost admired the craftsmanship of it. He called her Mija, which her grandfather had earned the right to call her, and Rodrigo had not. He asked about the property, about whether she was settled in, about whether the old house needed work. He mentioned that he and his wife Cecilia were thinking of coming out to see the place, to pay their respects, since they had of course been close to her grandfather in the final years. He left it to me, Marisol said simply, without inflection. Yes, Rodrigo said, and she could hear the effort it took him to keep his voice even. Of course, we just thought, family involvement, in honoring what he built. I'm family, Marisol said. You are, Rodrigo said. Absolutely. I only meant that there might be value in some kind of partnership arrangement. Going forward, if there are assets to be, I'll be in touch, Marisol said, when I have something to tell you. She ended the call. She sat for a moment in her grandfather's kitchen, with her hands flat on the table the way he had taught her. Both palms down, feel the surface, feel the ground under the floor, know where you stand. Then she called Gabriel Reyes and told him to make sure the perimeter of the legal situation was airtight. Already doing it, he said, in a tone that suggested he had been expecting the call. The appraisal took 9 days. Donna Whitfield worked methodically, pulling sample bottles from different production years, cataloging each case, photographing everything. She brought in a lab service on the 4th day to verify age and composition on a selection of bottles, and the lab results came back consistent with what the tags claimed. Aged as stated, composition matching the declared grains and processes, no tampering, no adulteration. The inventory was real. Every bottle was what her grandfather said it was. What emerged from Donna's assessment was a picture that Marisol had in her more optimistic 3 in the morning calculations, are roughly approximated, but that still landed with the weight of something real when she finally heard it spoken aloud by a professional who had no reason to be generous. The mash room held approximately 2,040 cases of aged spirits. The production years ranged from 1978 through 2001. The varieties included 17 distinct expressions. Rye aged from 12 to 45 years. The green Chile spirit in multiple vintages. Several experimental single malts and grain whiskies. And a botanical desert spirit, of which only 11 cases existed, and which Donna described, with the restraint of her profession failing her briefly, as potentially the most interesting thing she had put her hands on in 30 years. At conservative auction estimates, accounting for market variance, on the total value of the inventory was, Donna paused when she got to the number. She did it the way people pause before saying numbers that require the listener to prepare. $324 million. Marisol sat with that number for a long moment. Outside, the wind was moving through the cottonwood, and the sound of it was the same sound it had always been. Patient, seasonal, indifferent to the scale of human revelation. That's at conservative estimates, Donna said. The market for aged American whiskey continues to move upward. Some of these bottles, particularly the 1978 and 1982 ryes, and the botanical, at the right venue, with the right buyers, those numbers could be significantly higher. But conservatively, Marisol said. Conservatively, Donna confirmed. 324 million, on give or take. The room was quiet except for the wind and the sound of Marisol's own breathing, which she noticed was slower than usual. The way breathing gets when the body understands something important is happening and decides to move carefully. She thought of her grandfather in this room. She thought of him working alone through winter mornings and summer afternoons, filling barrels and sealing cases and writing his careful tags, while the public world outside believed he was finished. She thought of the stillness he must have felt in here, not the stillness of a man who had given up, but the stillness of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had decided that some things were worth doing in secret, over long time, without applause. She thought of the corridos he had sung when he thought no one was listening, and she understood now that they were not songs of mourning. They were songs of patience. They were songs you sang when you were doing something that would take a long time, but that would be, in the end, exactly what you had intended it to be. Donna left her with the draft assessment and a recommendation for 2 auction houses that specialized in rare spirits. She shook Marisol's hand at the door with a grip that communicated something beyond professional courtesy, something closer to respect, passed from one woman to another across a threshold that Marisol was just beginning to understand the dimensions of. After the truck's taillights disappeared down the county road, Marisol stood on the portal in the gathering dark and looked out at the distillery building. The tin roof caught what was left of the evening light and held it in the particular copper color she had always loved. The sign, half legible from the road, read, Vega, in letters that had been large once and had only gotten more honest with age. She thought about what came next. She thought about attorneys and appraisers and auction houses and the careful scaffolding of a process that would need to be built deliberately, without rushing, because rushing was what people did when they were afraid, and her grandfather had not built this over 20 years by being afraid. She thought about Rodrigo and Diane and her father at the kitchen table with his hands around the mug, not looking at her. She thought about the $200 in the envelope. She thought about 17 minutes on a bathroom floor and the specific quality of grief that comes from being managed out of someone else's convenience. She thought about all of those things, but not for long. Her grandfather had given her 10 minutes. She had used her extra time already. The work of living was waiting, and it was, for the first time in a long time, work that was entirely hers. The weeks that followed the appraisal moved with a quality she had not experienced before, a forward momentum that was purposeful rather than desperate, the specific sensation of moving towards something rather than away from it. She had spent most of her short adult life in the second mode, and the distinction in the first was noticeable in the body before it was noticeable in the mind. She woke in the mornings, and the waking had intention, and she went to sleep having completed things. The deficit of that feeling in the years prior was something she understood only now that it was gone. She began with the practical foundations, because her grandfather had taught her, by example more than instruction, that the practical foundations were what determined whether the larger structure held. She met with Gabriel Reyes in his office in Santa Fe and spent 4 hours working through the legal architecture of what needed to be in place. The probate estate was closed, but there were supplementary filings required to formally document the discovered inventory as part of her inheritance. Gabriel handled these with the focused efficiency of a man who had found this case significantly more interesting than his usual workload and was not entirely displeased about it. So he also filed a formal legal notice to Rodrigo Vega's attorneys, stating that any further challenges to the estate would be opposed vigorously and that the inventory discovery had been properly documented and reported to the probate court. The notice wasn't hostile in its language. It did not need to be. Its content accomplished what hostility would have anyway, with the added advantage of maintaining a legal record of clean procedure. She hired a security firm to install cameras at the Distillery building and new locks on the mash room. She did not tell anyone except Gabriel and Donna what was in there. She was aware, with the clarity of someone who had grown up in a family that had not always behaved well, that the information about what the mash room contained would change the behavior of people around her in ways that could not be entirely predicted or controlled. Information released too early was the same as control surrendered. She kept the circle small. She drove into Mora once a week for groceries and hardware, and the ordinary maintenance of a life that was, from the outside, unremarkable. She fixed the portal railing that had been loose since before her grandfather died. She cleared the overgrowth from the garden and discovered that the raised beds beneath it were intact, the soil still workable, the irrigation lines needing only minor repair. She found she liked the physical work, not because it was satisfying in a romantic sense, but because it gave her body something to do while her mind worked on larger problems, and she had always thought better with her hands occupied. The neighbors along the county road were few but present in the specific way of rural communities, not intrusive, but aware. A woman named Patricia Salazar, whose family had farmed the adjacent property for 4 generations, brought a pot of pozole 3 days after Marisol arrived and sat on the portal for an hour without asking any of the questions Marisol had braced for. She talked about Ernesto Vega, the way people talk about someone they had genuinely respected, with specificity, with the particular affection of someone who had known him not as a symbol, but as a neighbor who had fixed her fence once during a hard winter without being asked and never mentioned it afterward. "He talked about you," Patricia said, near the end of the visit. "In the last few years especially. And he said you had his grandmother's eyes. I never met his grandmother, so I don't know what that meant to him exactly. But the way he said it, you could tell it meant something important." Marisol held that. Was he all right toward the end? Patricia considered this with the care it deserved. "He was at peace," she said finally. "Not happy the way young people mean happy, but settled, like a man who had done what he came to do." The pozole was excellent. They parted warmly, and Patricia left without asking about the Distillery building, which Marisol registered as a specific form of generosity. The call from Rodrigo came again, less warm this time. He had received Gabriel's notice. His voice had the particular register of a man performing measured calm over something that was not calm at all. He mentioned, carefully, that he had heard the property was being given attention. He mentioned that he had always had an interest in the distillery's legacy, having spent time there as a child himself, which was technically true and entirely beside the point. He mentioned that certain family considerations deserved to be part of any larger conversation about the property's future. Marisol listened to all of it without interrupting. She had learned that people revealed more of what they actually wanted when you let them finish. "I appreciate you calling," she said when he was done. "I'll have Gabriel reach out when we're at a stage where outside input is relevant." The pause that followed had a texture. "Outside input," Rodrigo repeated. "I'm family, Marisol." "You are," she said, with the same absence of inflection she had used before. "So I'll be in touch." She did not enjoy those calls. She was not, at her core, someone who took pleasure in the power of withholding. But she understood, with a precision her grandfather had helped build in her over those summer visits, that there was a difference between cruelty and discipline, and that confusing the two was a mistake that cost you things you couldn't always get back. She had been told, in various ways, and by various people over the years, that she was too quiet, too guarded, too unwilling to let people in. What those people had generally meant was that she was unwilling to let them into the parts of her life that they wanted access to for reasons that served them rather than her. That was not guardedness. That was clarity. She continued the work. By the end of March, she had established a relationship with one of the auction houses Donna had recommended, a firm in New York with a specialized spirits division that had handled several landmark-aged whiskey sales in the previous 5 years and understood the current market with the depth that came from operating inside it. The specialist who took her call was a man named Theo Abramson, who had the rare professional quality of being genuinely excited by things, in a way that he did not bother to conceal because the excitement was warranted. He listened to Donna's assessment summary, asked precise questions about the provenance documentation, and then went quiet in the specific way of people who are doing arithmetic that is producing numbers they did not expect. "The 1978 rye," he said after a moment. "You have how many cases?" 14, Marisol said. Verified by lab analysis, dated accurately. Documentation from an independent lab service, signed and time-stamped. Another pause. "And the botanical expression." "The 11 cases." "Yes." "That," Theo said, with a deliberateness that suggested he was choosing words carefully, "is not a conservative estimate situation. That particular expression, if it is what the provenance suggests, and if the quality bears out in tasting, there is a conversation to be had with collectors that would not begin at any number, I want to say, out loud, yet without having my team look at this. How soon could your team come? How does next week work for you?" She said next week worked fine. She did not say that she had been waiting for this conversation since she first stood in the mash room and read her grandfather's handwriting on those small tags. She did not say that the patience required had been significant, and that maintaining it had taken a daily act of will that drew on reserves she had been building her whole life without knowing what they were for. She simply said next week was fine, and thanked him, and ended the call, and went outside and stood in the late March wind with her hands in her jacket pockets, and looked at the distillery building for a long time. The tin roof was doing its usual thing with the light. The sign was still itself, large letters weathered to honesty. She had a thought standing there that was not complex, but felt true. Her grandfather had not built this for money. The money was incidental, a consequence of the work and the time and the care, but not the reason. And he had built it because it was what he knew how to do and what he believed was worth doing. And he had continued doing it after the world stopped watching, because the world's attention had never been the point. The money was what time and quality produced when they were patient enough. The money was what happened when you didn't stop. She thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed. She thought about it when the weariness came. And it came because the logistics of what she was building were considerable, and she was doing most of it alone, without the support structure of people who had resources and experience and networks to draw on. She thought about it when the second call from Rodrigo's attorney arrived, this one more formal, raising questions about whether the inventory discovery constituted a separate asset class that should have been subject to probate accounting and therefore was potentially challengeable. Gabriel disposed of this argument in 2 paragraphs, but it cost time and attention that she would have preferred to spend elsewhere. She thought about it when her father called, the first call in 3 months, speaking in the carefully neutral tone of a man who has heard things secondhand and is trying to calibrate his positioning. He asked how she was. He asked about the property. He did not mention Diane. He did not apologize for the morning of her 20th birthday, or for any of the silences that had preceded it. He was kind in the specific way of someone who has decided to be kind because it seems strategically appropriate. And Marisol, who had spent enough time around that particular species of kindness to identify it by scent, simply listened and answered the questions he actually asked, and didn't offer anything beyond that. "You sound good," he said, near the end. "I am," she said. And this was true. Not triumphant. Not yet. Not exactly. But rooted. She was in a place that was hers, doing work that mattered, building something that had been waiting for her, and that she was capable of continuing. She was 20 years old, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The Theo Abramson visit was scheduled for the 2nd week of April. Theo Abramson arrived on a Tuesday, which turned out to be the kind of April morning that New Mexico produces when it decides to demonstrate what it is capable of. The sky a blue so deep and unqualified that it seemed almost aggressive, the air cool and moving, the mountains to the north holding their last snow in the high places where it belonged. He came with 2 colleagues, a spirits analyst named Marcus Webb, who had the specific economy of movement of someone who had learned to be careful with things that mattered, and a provenance specialist named Claire Duval, who carried a tablet and a camera and a case of testing equipment, and said very little for the first hour, which Marisol understood as a form of professional respect. The refusal to react before you had looked at everything on Theo himself was exactly what his phone presence had suggested. A man for whom genuine enthusiasm was a professional tool he had never needed to fake, because the things his work put in front of him were, in his considered opinion, worth being enthusiastic about. He was in his late 40s, dressed practically, with the kind of focused attention that made him good to have in a room when something important was happening, because he processed what he saw before he said anything about it. Marisol walked them to the Distillery building without preamble. She had learned that people who understood things appreciated being brought directly to the thing to be understood. She unlocked the main entrance, walked them through the main room with its copper stills, past the fermentation vessels, to the mash room door, and then stepped aside. And she let them enter first. The response was what she had come to recognize as the room's consistent effect on anyone who understood what they were looking at. A specific silence, a pause in the forward motion of a person who has encountered something that requires recalibration. Marcus stopped after 6 feet and looked at the shelves the way a geologist looks at a formation that contradicts the map. Claire raised her camera and began documenting without speaking. Theo stood in the center of the room, turned once slowly in a full circle, and said, almost to himself, "This is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Marisol asked. He turned to look at her. "I expected to be impressed," he said. "I didn't expect to be." He searched for the word with the care of someone who used words precisely. "Humbled," he said finally. So they worked for 2 full days. Marcus took samples from a systematic selection of bottles, not random, but mapped, pulling from each production decade, each expression, each barrel number that appeared in multiple years so that the aging trajectory could be verified. He worked with instruments that Marisol did not entirely understand, but that Claire explained in the occasional moment of spare time. A spectrometer for chemical composition, a chromatograph to verify the presence and ratio of compounds that developed specifically through long aging and could not be replicated by artificial means. Claire documented the provenance chain, the tags, the barrel records her grandfather had kept in a series of ledgers she found in a cabinet in the mash room on the second day, the land records showing continuous Vega ownership, on the tax filings from the distillery's public operating years that established the production methods and grain sources. Marisol had not known about the ledgers. She found them behind a false panel in the back of the cabinet, which she pulled open with a key from her grandfather's ring that she had tried in every lock she could find and had assumed was decorative or obsolete. The ledgers were 12 volumes, spanning 1971 to 2001, each one filled in her grandfather's meticulous hand. Every batch recorded, every barrel numbered, every aging vessel noted, every bottling date, every quantity. The level of documentation was extraordinary. It was the record of a man who understood that the work would outlast him, and who had decided that the work deserved to be witnessed accurately, even if only by the pages that held it. Claire held the first ledger for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at Marisol. "Does your family know these exist?" "No," Marisol said. "I found them yesterday." Claire nodded slowly. "These," she said, with a precision that carried weight, "are the difference between a significant collection and a historically important one. With documentation at this level, the provenance case is not just strong, it is irrefutable." That word settled in the room with the completeness of something that had been waiting to be said. On the evening of the second day, the 3 of them sat with Marisol in her grandfather's kitchen, around the same table where the letter had waited for her, and Theo laid out what they had found. The lab analysis, preliminary at this stage, but consistent with expectations, confirmed the ages claimed on the tags. The chemical signatures of the oldest rise, the 1978, the 1981, the 1983, showed the specific compound ratios that developed only through decades of interaction between spirit and wood, ratios that could not be manufactured or accelerated, and that every serious buyer in the market would recognize as authentic. The Green Chili Botanical series, which her grandfather had produced in only 5 vintages between 1988 and 1997, was in Theo's estimation the most singular thing in the collection, not because of age alone, but because of uniqueness. There was nothing like it in the world. There had never been anything like it in the world. It occupied a category by itself, and categories by themselves, in the auction market for rare spirits, generated the kind of competitive attention that produced outcomes no formula could reliably predict. "Sorn, I want to be responsible about how I say this," Theo said, looking at Marisol directly. "The estimate Donna Whitfield gave you, the 324 million, that is a sound, professionally defensible assessment based on current market comparables." He paused. "It is also probably conservative." Marisol held his gaze. "Probably," she said. "The Green Chile series," he said. "The 11 cases. There is a buyer. I will not name him without his consent. But he is a collector of significant means who has been publicly specific about what he is looking for in American heritage spirits, who I believe would want those bottles very badly. When a buyer wants something very badly, and it does not exist anywhere else, the calculus changes." "How much does the calculus change?" Theo glanced at Marcus, from who gave the small nod of someone confirming a number they have already discussed. "For the Green Chili series alone," Theo said, "we believe a dedicated sale, properly structured, with the right buyers in the room, could yield between 60 and 90 million. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the cottonwood was doing its evening thing, the leaves catching the last light and turning it over like coins. Marisol looked at the table surface. She thought of her grandfather bottling those 11 cases, the only 11 that would ever exist of that particular expression, in a room that no one would enter for 20 years. She thought of him sealing them and writing the tags and placing them on the shelf with the same deliberateness with which he had done everything, knowing that the value of what he was making would not be legible to the world until the world had caught up to it. She thought of him singing in the kitchen. She thought of his hands. She kept her face neutral, not because she was not feeling things, but because the feelings were hers. "What are the next steps?" she asked. Theo walked her through it methodically. The preliminary lab results would be formalized into a certified report within 3 weeks. A full catalog of the collection would be produced, cross-referenced with the ledger documentation, and reviewed by a second independent appraiser to satisfy the auction house's due diligence requirements. Once the catalog was complete, they would structure the sale in phases, not releasing everything at once, which would flood the market and suppress prices, but creating a sequence of curated offerings that sustained and built collector attention over time. The first phase, he suggested, should be the older rise, the 1978 and 1981 vintages, both because they were the most verifiable and because they would establish the collection's credibility with buyers before the more unusual expressions came to market. The green chili series would come later, after the market had absorbed the existence of the Vega collection and the appetite for it had been properly cultivated. This was not a process of weeks. It was a process of months. Marisol understood this, and the understanding did not frustrate her the way it might have frustrated someone who had not grown up watching her grandfather work in measures of years rather than days. She had inherited, along with everything else, his sense of what things required in terms of time. She walked Theo and his colleagues to their rental car in the early evening, the mountains to the north going dark, and the first stars appearing over the eastern plain the way they always did out here. Suddenly, in numbers that the city sky never permitted. She thanked them. Theo shook her hand and held it for a moment. "Your grandfather," he said, "was operating at a level of quality that the market didn't have the language for when he was working. It does now." She nodded. She knew. She watched the car go down the county road and disappear around the curve. And then she stood alone in the April evening and let the land be quiet around her for a while. There was a pleasure in the quiet that she had not been able to access until recently. Not the pleasure of relief, which was passive, but the pleasure of presence, which required something of you in return. She was here. She was building something. The ground under her feet was solid. On her way back inside, she stopped at the Distillery building and unlocked the main door and stood in the entrance for a moment without going in. The smell of the place came to her, and she breathed it in the way she breathed the mountain air when the storms came in, deeply, consciously, with the understanding that some things deserve to be noticed. "I know what you were doing," she said aloud, to the room, to the building, to the version of her grandfather, who existed still in the things he had made. "I'm going to finish it." The news broke 6 weeks later. She had not planned for it to break the way it did, and which was to say publicly, and with the particular momentum of a story that the world decides, all at once, it is interested in. The auction house had released a press announcement about the forthcoming sale, carefully worded, professionally restrained, identifying the collection as a historically significant discovery of American heritage spirits from a small batch New Mexico producer. The announcement mentioned the distillery's name, the production years, the general scope of the collection. It did not mention Marisol by name. It did not need to. The Spirit's press picked it up within 12 hours. A writer for a prominent trade publication called Donna Whitfield, who confirmed the basic outlines without elaborating. A food and culture journalist in Santa Fe drove to Mora County, saw the distillery building from the road. I'd photographed the sign and filed a piece that evening about the Vega family legacy in New Mexico spirits production. That piece was picked up by 2 national outlets by the following morning. By the end of the second day, the story had a shape that Marisol recognized from the outside as the shape of something the world had decided was interesting. The human element of it. The narrative of a grandfather who had kept working in secret for 20 years. Of a granddaughter who had inherited what the world had not known existed. It was the kind of story that had the compression of fable without the cleanness of one, which made it more compelling rather than less. Her phone began receiving calls from numbers she did not recognize. She answered none of them. Gabriel Reyes fielded the legal inquiries. Theo Abramson's office managed the industry press. She appointed a communications firm on Theo's recommendation, a small, precise operation run by a woman named Sasha Park, who specialized in managing the public presentation of significant estate transactions and who understood, without having to be told, that Marisol's primary interest was in controlling the narrative rather than inhabiting it. Sasha's first advice was characteristically direct. "You don't have to say anything to anyone you don't want to say anything to," she said on their first call. But the story is moving. It's better to have a clear, true version on record than to have the gaps filled in by people who are guessing. Marisol agreed to a single interview. 1 journalist, 1 outlet. A long-form piece for a publication that Sasha selected for its seriousness and its readership, which overlapped significantly with the collector community that the auction house was targeting. The interview took place at the distillery in the main room, with the copper stills visible behind them. Marisol answered questions carefully and accurately. She talked about her grandfather, about his work ethic and his precision, about the summers she had spent on the property as a child. She talked about finding the letter and the keys and the mash room. She did not perform emotion, because the emotion was real and did not require performance. And when the journalist, a woman named Evelyn Marsh, who had been writing about food and culture for 20 years and had learned to recognize the difference between a story told and a story inhabited, noticed the difference and honored it by not pushing for more than was offered. She did not discuss the family difficulties in specific terms. She said only that her grandfather had chosen to leave the property to her, that she understood the responsibility of that choice, and that she intended to honor the work he had done by completing it properly. The piece ran 3 weeks later, on a Sunday. It was long and reported and personal in the way that the best pieces of that genre managed to be. It told the story of the distillery through the history of New Mexico spirits production, or through the specifics of what her grandfather had made, and how and why. And then it told the story of the discovery with the care of a writer who understood that some things deserved not to be rushed. Marisol read it at the kitchen table on Sunday morning with coffee and the particular quiet of the property before the wind started. It was accurate. It was fair. It was the true version, told in the way her grandfather would have wanted, with attention to the work first and the wonder second. The calls that followed were of a different nature. Collectors reached out through Theo's office. 3 separate buyers expressed interest in acquiring the Green Chili series outright, rather than waiting for the auction. One of them, a private collector whose name Marisol knew from the trade publications, made an offer that was significant enough that Gabriel recommended she have it independently assessed before declining, which she did, and then declined. She was not selling the Green Chile series privately and preemptively. She was taking it to auction, the way Theo had recommended, the way that would establish the value publicly and permanently, the way that would ensure the record was clear about what her grandfather had made and what it was worth. This decision was partly strategic, and partly something she could not have articulated precisely, but that felt right in the specific way of decisions that align with the values of the person making them rather than merely the opportunity in front of them. Oh, it was the decision her grandfather would have made. She was certain of that. The response within the family came in stages, each one revealing a different facet of the same underlying dynamic. Her uncle Rodrigo's attorney sent a formal letter within a week of the Sunday peace running, arguing once more that the inventory had not been properly assessed during probate, and that Rodrigo, as a direct descendant of Ernesto Vega, had a legitimate claim to a share of the discovered assets. The argument was more sophisticated than the previous one. Someone had engaged a better attorney. But Gabriel's response was thorough and left no opening. The probate had been conducted with the information available at the time. The inventory had been discovered post-closure by the sole heir named in the will. The law was unambiguous, or there was no viable claim. The letter was a test of her resolve, she understood, more than a genuine legal strategy. She met it with the same response she had been meeting everything with since the beginning. Precise process, no unnecessary engagement, no emotional reaction that could be interpreted as uncertainty. Rodrigo called again himself, a week after the attorney letter. This time, the warmth was entirely gone, replaced by a directness that she found, in a strange way, easier to navigate. He said plainly that he felt their grandfather had not been thinking clearly in his final years, that the decision to leave everything to Marisol while bypassing the rest of the family was not consistent with the man he had known, and he said that the family, meaning himself and his branch of it, deserved some consideration in light of what had been found. Marisol let him finish. "What consideration are you asking for, specifically?" she said. There was a pause. "A conversation," Rodrigo said, "about how this is handled." "I'm handling it," Marisol said. "I was left it. I am the one responsible for it. That is what the will says, and what the court confirmed." "Marisol." "Rodrigo," she said, and she used his name the way her grandfather had taught her to use names when a thing needed to be said clearly. Once, directly, without decoration. "He left it to me 3 times. My name 3 times in the document. I know you think you know what he would have wanted. I know him differently than you do." She paused. "I'll be in touch when there's something I want to tell you." She ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone on the table. She felt none of the satisfaction she had imagined feeling in moments like this, back when she had been 20 years old with $43 and a borrowed car and a future that looked like weather with no forecast. What she felt was something quieter and more settled, not victory, but alignment. The same word that kept returning to her. The sense of being in the right place, doing the right thing for the right reasons. Her father's second call was harder because her father was harder, not because he was crueler than Rodrigo, but because he was weaker. And weakness in a parent produced its own specific category of wound that had never entirely healed, and probably wouldn't. And she had made a certain peace with that. He called on a Wednesday evening, and this time he did not perform warmth. He was simply tired and uncertain, and she could hear in his voice the specific sound of a man who had made choices he was beginning to want to revise, and was not sure how. He said he had read the piece in the magazine. He said he was proud of her, and she could tell he meant it, which made it more complicated rather than less. He said he was sorry he hadn't. And then he stopped, because some things are hard to finish, and the unfinished ones are sometimes more honest than the completed ones. "You don't have to," she said. "I know." There was a silence. Outside the property, the spring evening was doing what spring evenings in Mora County did, cooling quickly, the light going from gold to rose to the particular blue that preceded dark. "Are you all right out there?" her father asked. "Yes," she said. I really am. He always said you would be, her father said. Your grandfather. He used to say, I don't know if you knew this, he used to say that you were the one who understood what the land was for. She held the phone and looked out the window at the Distillery building, its tin roof the color of an old penny in the last light. He told me some things, she said. Not that. She allowed herself, after the call ended, a longer quiet than usual. She sat on the portal in the cooling evening and thought about Ernesto Vega and what it meant to be understood by someone who was gone now, understood so specifically and so correctly that the evidence of it was visible in legal documents and labeled bottles and 12 ledger volumes in careful handwriting. She thought about what it meant to be the person who carried that forward. The first phase of the auction was announced in mid-May, scheduled for late June at the auction house's New York facility. The preliminary catalog was released to registered collectors and industry press, a document of considerable production value that Theo's team had assembled with the care appropriate to the material. The cover was a photograph of the 1978 rye bottle against the mash room shelving, taken by Claire Duval on her first visit. The image was clean and unaffected, and somehow, despite its simplicity, managed to communicate the essential quality of the thing, that it was old in the right way, that it had been made by someone who knew what they were doing, that it had been waiting with patience for the right moment to be known. The collector community response was immediate and significant. Theo called her the day after the catalog released. His voice had the particular contained energy of a professional who is managing genuine excitement. Pre-sale inquiries, he said, were running well beyond what they had projected. 3 institutional buyers, firms that acquired for investment portfolios, had registered. 7 private collectors of the category that Theo described, with careful neutrality, as seriously motivated. The estimated pre-sale value for Phase 1, originally projected at $40 million, had been revised upward by the internal team to $62. The market was paying attention. The market had decided that the Vega collection was not simply a curiosity or a regional story with a pleasant human angle. It was a material event in the American heritage spirits world, the emergence of a body of work that was in some respects unmatched, that occupied a historical position between the living tradition and the lost one, that represented what American craft distilling had been capable of in its serious form before the industry's recent commercial renaissance had retroactively made the category legible. Her grandfather had not been ahead of the market. He had simply been right about the work, continuously, for 30 years, and the market had eventually developed the capacity to understand what that meant. She flew to New York for the auction. It was her first time in the city, which she did not mention to anyone, because it did not seem relevant to the business at hand, and because she was not interested in performing a particular kind of naivety for anyone's benefit. The auction house was in Midtown, occupying several floors of a building that was serious without being ostentatious, the aesthetic of an organization that dealt in significant things and had decided that the things themselves provided sufficient impressiveness without the need for supplementary drama. Theo met her in the lobby and walked her through the sale room before the auction began. The bottles from Phase 1 were displayed in a climate-controlled case that ran along one wall. 14 cases of the 1978 rye, 12 cases of the 1981, and a selection of the mid-period green chile expressions that Theo had included as a preview of what would come in subsequent phases. They were beautiful in the particular way of things that have been made carefully and waited long. The labels, her grandfather's handwriting on small cards, preserved in clear holders, were the most beautiful part. Marisol stood in front of the case and looked at a bottle of the 1978 rye for a long time. She thought of the morning it had been distilled, a morning in 1978, before she existed, when her grandfather had been a man in his early 30s, with his wife alive and his distillery running, and his hands doing the work they knew how to do. She thought of him deciding, at some point in that decade, that what he was making was worth keeping rather than selling. Oh no, she thought of what patience meant at that scale. Not days or weeks, but years, decades. The faith that the future would eventually be capable of receiving what the present wasn't ready for. She placed one hand briefly on the glass of the case. Not for anyone else, just for herself. The auction room filled with people who understood what they were looking at. Theo had said the room would feel different from a typical sale, and it did. There was a quality of attention that was not the competitive electricity of bidders, anxious to win, but the focused presence of people who had come because they wanted to be in the room when something historically significant occurred. Marisol sat in the back with Sasha and Gabriel. She had declined the front row position Theo had offered, not from false modesty, but from the genuine preference to watch rather than be watched during the part of this process that did not require her participation. The auctioneer opened with a brief account of the collection's history, the Vega family, the New Mexico land, the 30 years of operation, the discovery of the mash room inventory. He spoke of Ernesto Vega with the compressed respect of a professional who has learned that the stories behind the objects are part of what the room is buying. Then he opened bidding on Lot 1, the 1978 Vega Reserve Rye. Single barrel, 14 bottles. Certified 45 years of age. Provenance documented and independently verified. Opening bid, $60,000 per bottle. There was a pause that had a quality she had not expected, not hesitation, but the particular stillness of a room deciding how seriously to announce itself. The first paddle went up before the auctioneer had finished repeating the opening. Then 2 more. The bidding moved quickly through 60, and then 80, and then crossed $100,000 per bottle with the same matter-of-fact momentum of water finding its level. She watched the paddles with the concentration she had once given to restaurant sections during a dinner rush, tracking, predicting, reading the room. At $140,000, 3 bidders remained. At $160,000, 2. At $185,000 per bottle, a man near the front, one of the institutional buyers, Theo had told her, a firm that specialized in acquiring heritage American craft assets for long-term holding, raised his paddle once more. The remaining bidder paused. The pause stretched. The gavel came down. $185,000 per bottle. 14 bottles per case. 14 cases. She did the arithmetic without the need for a calculator. She had done it many times in the previous weeks, and the number was familiar to her now, but it still landed differently when the gavel made it real. $36,680,000 for the 1978 rye alone. She did not react visibly. Sasha, beside her, who had attended many auctions and prided herself on her composure, exhaled slowly and quietly. Gabriel Reyes wrote something on the notepad in his lap and underlined it twice. The subsequent lots moved with the same disciplined upward pressure. The 1981 rye exceeded the pre-sale estimate by 22%, while the mid-period green Chile expressions, offered as a preview of the forthcoming Phase 2, sparked a competitive flurry that ended at numbers Theo had not projected even in his upward revisions. By the end of Phase 1, the total had exceeded $94 million. Phase 1, the first tranche, the opener. Afterward, in a private room Theo had arranged, he sat across from Marisol and Gabriel and Sasha and placed his hands on the table with the particular completeness of someone who has just witnessed something they will describe for the rest of their career. Phase 2, he said, is going to be different. She looked at him. How different? The room today made a statement, he said. Word is going to move in the collector community. By the time we announce Phase 2, which includes the full Green Chile series and the Madeira-finished single malts. The positioning will be different. The buyers who didn't participate today will want to participate next time. The ones who did will want more. He paused. I told you the green chili series could yield 60 to 90 million. He looked at her steadily. I want to revise that. She waited. I think we should structure it as the anchor of a dedicated sale, he said. Not as part of a mixed lot, a single expression auction with a buyer presentation beforehand, inviting the top 12 collectors and 3 institutional buyers directly. Private event, curated attendance, the kind of room where the competitive dynamic operates differently than a general sale. He said the number he had in mind as an opening bid for the series. It was not a number she had heard before in this context. It was a number that would, when it appeared in the final accounting, push the total well beyond the conservative estimate. She looked at the table surface. She thought of 11 cases, sealed in wax, sitting on a shelf in a mash room in Mora County for 20 years. She thought of her grandfather placing the last one on the shelf and writing the tag in his careful hand, and then locking the door and going back to the smaller house and singing to himself in the kitchen while the cottonwood moved outside in the New Mexico wind. She thought of all the seasons that had passed above that room. All right, she said, let's do it that way. The flight back to New Mexico was at 7 in the morning, and she was at the airport by 5. No drinking bad coffee in a terminal that had the specific desolation of airports before dawn. All fluorescent light and the particular solitude of people in transit who have not yet assembled the versions of themselves they present to the world. She sat with her bad coffee and looked at nothing in particular. She thought about the auction room and the gavel and the number at the end. She thought about what $94 million meant in the practical architecture of a life, not abstractly, not in the terms of fantasy that the amount might invite if she were a different kind of person, but concretely. She thought about the water rights along the creek that needed a legal review to be fully secured. She thought about the distillery building and what it would require to be made operational again, not for the purpose of selling the inventory, which was being handled, but for the purpose of continuing the work, of actually making whiskey again in the way her grandfather had made it, with the same attention and the same patience and the same disregard for whether the world was watching. She thought about what it would mean to hire people from the county, people whose families had been there as long as the Vegas, people who understood the land and the work and who would do it properly. She thought about the raised beds in the garden, which she had been meaning to plant since February and hadn't yet found the time. She thought about Patricia Salazar and the postal and the specific form of generosity that did not ask questions. She thought about her grandfather telling her father that she was the one who understood what the land was for. She thought she was beginning to understand what he had meant. The plane lifted off in the gray before dawn and banked south and west, and through the window, the city appeared briefly as a grid of lights below, organized and purposeful in the dark. And then it fell away, and there was nothing but the vast dark of the continent, the occasional scatter of lights from small places, the suggestion of mountains, and then the particular quality of New Mexico sky beginning to pale in the east. She put her head back and closed her eyes. She had things to do when she landed. The work was not finished. In some ways it was just beginning. But beneath the tiredness and the forward motion and the list of things requiring attention, she felt something she did not try to name because some things lost precision when you named them. She had been 20 years old with $43 and a borrowed car and a future that looked like weather with no forecast. She was still 20 years old. The future had acquired, without her permission, a shape. She landed in Albuquerque at 9 in the morning and drove north with the windows down, the May air doing what May air in New Mexico did, carrying the smell of blooming chamisa and the particular mineral quality of a landscape that had been here long before anyone had names for it and intended to remain long after the names were gone. The mountains were clear to the east, the Sangre de Cristos holding their snow at the peaks in a way that would persist into June if the year was kind. She stopped once for gas and a breakfast burrito from a place she had been going since childhood, ordered at a window by a woman who did not recognize her, and took her order with the same indifferent efficiency she applied to everyone, which Marisol found deeply, specifically restoring after 2 days in a city where she had felt, at every moment, observed. The property received her the way it always did, without ceremony, without commentary, exactly as it was. The cottonwood at the corner was in full leaf now. The garden she had been working was coming up in the raised beds. The distillery building stood where it had always stood, with its tin roof and its half-legible sign and its particular quality of patient permanence. And she got out of the car and stood in the driveway for a moment, and breathed the air and felt the ground under her feet. She had $94 million coming, and a Phase 2 auction to prepare for, and a list of practical tasks that had been accumulating during her 2 days in New York. She went inside and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table and wrote the list. It was a long list. She started at the top. The first item was the water rights. Her grandfather's land included a creek easement that had been in the Vega family for 120 years, but the documentation was old, and the legal status of the water allocation under current state law required review. She had been told this could take months, which was fine. She had learned in the previous several weeks that months was a unit of time she was comfortable with, and she called the water rights attorney Gabriel had recommended and scheduled an appointment. The second item was the building assessment. The distillery structure was sound. She had had that confirmed by an engineer in March. But sound wasn't the same as operational. Making the building functional again, for the purpose of actually producing whiskey rather than merely housing inventory, would require specific work. Plumbing, electrical, ventilation upgrades, regulatory compliance with the state and federal agencies that governed distillery operations. She had been in contact with a licensed contractor from Taos who had experience with historic agricultural structures and who had, when she described the building and its history, said the words that she had learned to value in a professional. This is interesting. I want to look at it. The third item was the license. New Mexico's distillery licensing process was not simple, but it was navigable. Gabriel had already made preliminary inquiries. The Vega distillery had held a license that had lapsed when her grandfather ceased public operations in 2002. Reinstating rather than applying fresh required a specific process that was, he said, proceeding. She worked through the list with the same methodical attention her grandfather had applied to his ledgers, addressing each item in its proper order, not rushing the ones that required patience and not delaying the ones that required action. She had learned, from watching her grandfather's example across those summers and across the evidence of his 20-year secret project, that the distinction between those two categories was the essential skill, knowing which things you pushed and which things you let develop at their own pace, and not confusing them. By the end of June, the Phase 1 sale proceeds had cleared, and the financial reality of what had happened settled into the practical landscape of her life, with a specificity that was both more and less dramatic than she had anticipated. More, because the number was real and large, and changed the architecture of possibility in ways she was still mapping. Less, because the day-to-day texture of her life on the property had not changed in the essential ways. She still woke at first light, still made coffee at the kitchen table, still went out to check the garden and the building and the land in the morning before anything else. The money was real, and the property was also real. The property was what she lived in. The money was a tool. She thought about that distinction often in those weeks, the difference between what you lived in and what you used. She had grown up around people who confused the two, who accumulated things they could not inhabit and inhabited things they had not built, and the confusion had made them restless in ways they couldn't diagnose. Her grandfather had never made that mistake. He had lived in his work the way she lived in this land, completely, specifically, without the anxiety of the person who suspects they are in the wrong place. She set aside a portion of the Phase 1 proceeds for the distillery restoration, not the full amount required, which would come in phases as the project developed, but enough to begin. She hired the Taos contractor, whose name was Felix Montoya, and who turned out to be exactly what his initial response had suggested, a man who looked at old structures with genuine curiosity rather than the professional neutrality of someone who sees only a project. He spent 2 days walking the distillery building before he gave her a preliminary plan, and the plan was respectful of what the building was. It did not propose to modernize or update so much as to restore and stabilize, preserving the character of the original structure while making it safe and functional. She also, in those weeks, hired her first employee. Her name was Valentina Cruz, and she was 26, from a family in Mora, who had been connected to agricultural work in the county for 3 generations. Valentina had studied food science in Albuquerque. He had worked briefly in a commercial winery in the Mesilla Valley, and had come back to Mora County because she said when Marisol interviewed her, decided that the work she wanted to do existed here rather than somewhere with better infrastructure. Marisol hired her on the spot, which was not how she had intended to do it, but some decisions are clarified by the presence of the person rather than the process of evaluation. Valentina's first assignment was the ledger transcription, taking her grandfather's 12 handwritten volumes and creating a digital record, cross-referenced with the auction catalog, that would serve as the permanent archive of the Vega production history. It was painstaking work, and the kind that required patience and precision, and a genuine interest in what the ledgers contained rather than simply what they represented. Valentina proved, within the first week, to have all 3 qualities. She also had opinions about grain sourcing and fermentation timing that she expressed with the careful directness of someone who had ideas and had learned to offer them without presuming they would be welcomed. Marisol welcomed them. She had not built anything alone in her life and did not intend to start now. The Phase 2 auction was announced in early July for a date in late September. Theo's office managed the announcement with considerably more fanfare than Phase 1 had received, which was appropriate given what Phase 1 had established. The Vega collection was no longer an emerging story. It was a confirmed one, and the collector community had spent the intervening months doing what collector communities do when something significant appears: talking, positioning, planning. The Green Chili series was announced as the anchor of a dedicated evening sale, available only to invited buyers. Theo had curated the invitation list with the precision of someone who understood that the room itself was part of the result. That scarcity of access created a quality of attention that generalized availability could not replicate. 14 collectors and 4 institutional buyers received invitations. All 14 collectors confirmed attendance. 2 of the institutional buyers confirmed. The remaining 2 sent representatives with bidding authority, which amounted to the same thing. So the pre-sale presentation was held at the auction house 2 days before the evening event. Marisol attended this one differently than she had attended the Phase 1 auction, not as a quiet presence in the back, but as a participant in the presentation itself. Theo had asked her to speak briefly about the collection. She had agreed to speak about her grandfather. She stood in a room of 14 serious collectors and 5 institutional representatives and talked about Ernesto Vega for 12 minutes. She talked about his hands and his ledgers and his corridos sung in an empty kitchen. She talked about the green Chile spirit specifically, about the variety of Chile he had used, which was a regional cultivar from the Mora Valley that had been grown by the same family for 60 years and was available nowhere else. Now about the specific distillation process he had developed over 3 decades of iteration, about the way he had described the spirit to her once when she was 11, standing in the main room of the distillery while it was still operational. He had said, and she quoted this exactly because she had never forgotten it, that the spirit tasted like the land in July when the afternoon rain is coming in from the mountains and the chamisa is blooming, and the air has that particular quality that you can only find in this specific place at this specific moment. And that he had decided his job was simply to put that into a bottle and then wait for someone to be ready to understand it. The room was quiet when she finished. It was the specific quiet of people who have had their attention captured by something they did not expect, and who were taking a moment before they returned to their professional composure. That evening, after the presentation, 3 of the collectors approached her separately to tell her, in their different ways, that they had not expected what they heard, and that it had changed how they understood what they were bidding on. She thanked them without elaboration. She did not need to elaborate. The 12 minutes had said the thing, and the thing had landed, and that was what speaking was for. The evening sale took place on a Thursday in late September. The room held fewer people than Phase 1, by design, by Theo's careful curation, but the quality of attention in it was of a different order. These were buyers who had come specifically, who had arranged their schedules and their capital and their intentions around this particular night. The room had the feeling of a thing that has been prepared for. The Green Chile series was offered as 11 cases, each case containing 12 bottles, as a single lot. Theo had insisted on this, not splitting the series, not offering individual cases, but presenting the complete body of work as the unified thing it was. Marisol had agreed immediately, because it was the right decision, and she had known it was the right decision before he said it, because her grandfather would have understood that some things were complete only when they were whole. The opening bid was set at $65 million for the series. The auctioneer said the number into the quiet room with the same professional neutrality he would have applied to any number, which was itself a kind of performance, the refusal to editorialize on a figure that the room already understood. 4 paddles went up simultaneously. What followed was not the rapid escalation of the Phase 1 bidding, which had moved quickly with the momentum of a market finding its level. This was slower, more deliberate, the movement of people who had thought carefully about where they were willing to go, and were now discovering where that was in relation to each other. The bids moved in increments of 2 million, then 5, then 10, as the field narrowed. At 90 million, 3 bidders remained. At 105 million, 2. Marisol watched from her seat beside Sasha, with the stillness she had learned from a man who had bottled patience and put it on a shelf for decades. At $117 million, and a woman near the front, one of the private collectors, a New York-based buyer whom Theo had described as someone who acquired only things she intended to keep, raised her paddle one final time. The remaining bidder, an institutional representative who had been methodical and precise throughout, paused. The pause extended. He set his paddle down. The gavel fell. $117 million for 11 cases of Vega Green Chile Spirit. The room did not erupt. It exhaled. A collective, controlled release of held breath from people who had come to witness something and had witnessed it. There was applause, not the competitive kind, but the kind that recognizes an event. And then the room returned to itself, and people began the quiet conversations that follow significant moments. Marisol sat very still. Sasha put a hand briefly on her arm. Gabriel, on her other side, wrote the number on his notepad and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her. She thought of 11 cases sitting on a shelf in a mash room in Mora County, New Mexico, sealed in wax, in the dark, through 20 years of seasons. She thought of the morning her grandfather had sealed the last one. She thought of what patience looked like from the inside. Not the romantic version, the patient as virtue narrative she had heard assigned to people after the fact. The actual insight of patience, which was simply continuing to do the work correctly when no one was watching, and when the result was not yet visible, and when the only measure of whether you were doing the right thing was your own honest assessment of the quality of what you were making. That was what he had done for 30 years. Alone, in the dark, with perfect records, and a locked door, and a letter waiting on a kitchen table for the specific person he had chosen to receive it. She allowed herself, in the privacy of her stillness in that room full of people, to feel the full weight of it. Not just the money, though the money was real and significant and would matter in the practical world, in ways she had already begun to plan. But the thing behind the money, the vindication of a life lived in a particular way, the confirmation that the work had been worth doing, the knowledge that the world had finally caught up to what her grandfather had understood for decades. She felt, for the first time since standing in the mash room and reading the tags on those first shelves, the specific quality of grief that comes not from loss, but from the understanding that someone you loved was even more extraordinary than you had known while they were alive to be told so. She let herself feel it for as long as it needed. Then she folded it, put it somewhere she could reach, and stood up to go speak with Theo. The final accounting of the Vega collection, across all phases of the sale, which extended through the following spring, as the remaining inventory was released in carefully sequenced tranches, came to $341 million, $17 million above the conservative estimate that Donna Whitfield had given her in the mash room on a cold March morning when the scope of the thing had first become legible. The number was reported in the trade press with the precision of the industry, and in the general press with the slightly breathless quality that large numbers in unexpected contexts tend to produce in general journalism. The story was told again, in various forms and with various emphasis, by writers who found different aspects of it most compelling. The grandfather's secret decades of work, the discovery by the expelled granddaughter, the record auction prices for American heritage spirits, the particular poetry of the Green Chile series, the ledgers. Marisol read none of the coverage except the pieces she had agreed to participate in, which were two: a follow-up with Evelyn Marsh for the same publication that had run the original piece, and a short profile in a spirits industry journal that focused primarily on the distillery's production history rather than the family narrative. Both pieces were accurate. Both treated her grandfather's work with the seriousness it deserved. She did not respond to the others, not because she was hostile to the attention, but because she had things to do, and the attention wasn't one of them. The work was what it had always been: present, specific, requiring her actual participation in order to proceed. The distillery restoration took 11 months. Felix Montoya and his crew worked through the fall and winter and into the following spring. And Marisol worked alongside them when her schedule allowed, and supervised when it didn't, and made decisions about the building with the same combination of historical respect and practical intelligence that her grandfather had applied to his ledgers. They preserved the original copper stills, which the restoration metallurgist determined were not only structurally sound, but in better condition than most equipment of their age, a consequence, she understood, of her grandfather's habit of maintaining everything even when it was not in active use, because things maintained themselves through care, whether or not they were being used for their stated purpose. The mash room was restored last. Felix had proposed it as a separate phase, understanding intuitively that it required a different quality of attention. So the shelves were kept. They were part of the structure of the room now, as much as the stone floor and the high window. The empty spaces where the cases had stood were present and visible, and she did not fill them with anything. They were a record of what had been there. Records deserved to be kept. She applied for the distillery license in October and received it in February, which Gabriel said was faster than expected, though slower than it should have been, which was the standard paradox of regulatory processes, and one she had accepted as a feature of the landscape rather than an anomaly. The first new batch of Vega whiskey was distilled in April, exactly 1 year after Theo Abramson and his colleagues had first walked into the mash room. It was a rye, because rye was where the Vega tradition had begun, and it seemed right to begin again there. Valentina had been deeply involved in the grain sourcing. She had found a farmer in the county, 3 properties over, who was growing the same heritage rye variety that her grandfather's early ledgers referenced, which had been a discovery that neither of them had expected, and that had moved Marisol in a way she had not anticipated, the small miracle of continuity finding its way through the gaps in time. The distillation on that April morning was not a ceremony. It was work. Careful, specific, attentive work that proceeded according to the process her grandfather had documented in his ledgers, and that she and Valentina had spent months studying and understanding. Felix was there because he had earned the right to witness the first day of what his hands had helped make possible. Patricia Salazar came because Marisol had invited her, and because she was the kind of neighbor who understood what an invitation from someone like Marisol meant. They did not make speeches. They simply worked. And when the first new whiskey moved through the still, and the distillery smelled the way it had smelled in the photographs from its operating years, of grain and heat and the particular alchemy of transformation, Marisol stood in the mash room and breathed it in. Her grandfather had described this smell once, in one of the personal entries in his ledgers, that she had read so many times she had memorized it without intending to. So he wrote that the smell of a distillery in full operation was the smell of potential being made actual, of grain that was nothing in itself becoming something, through water and heat and time, that it could not have been otherwise. He wrote that he found it more moving each year he worked, not less, which was the opposite of what familiarity usually did to things. She understood that now, in the way that you understand things that someone you love has said to you only after they are gone to explain them, not as information received, but as recognition arrived at. The work continued. The second batch was corn. The third was an experimental green Chile spirit, not a replica of her grandfather's formula, because she had decided early that replication was not what she was building. She was building a continuation, which was a different thing. It shared roots with what came before. It was not the same plant. Valentina had strong opinions about the green Chile sourcing that aligned closely with Marisol's own instincts, and together they spent 3 months developing relationships with Chile growers in the region, whose practices and varieties met the standard she had set. The standard was simple to state and difficult to meet. It had to be specific to this place at this time, the way her grandfathers had been specific to this place at that time. Local, seasonal, made from what the land and the people of the land actually produced. Not a formula, but a practice. The life on the property settled into a shape she had not been able to imagine from the outside of it. Full, layered, and demanding and satisfying in the way that real work is when it aligns with the thing you are actually for. She woke in the mornings to a property that was alive with purpose. The distillery building, which had been silent for 20 years, hummed. The garden was productive. The land was managed with the care of someone who intended to be there for a long time. She hired 2 more people from the county in the fall of the 2nd year, and a 4th in the spring of the 3rd. None of them had been recruited from outside the region. She had made that a quiet principle early. The work of this land should employ the people of this land, because her grandfather had understood that a distillery was not only what was in the bottles, but what it made possible for the community around it. And that principle was worth carrying forward as part of the tradition, even though it had not been written in the ledgers. She established the Ernesto Vega Foundation in the 2nd year, endowed with a portion of the auction proceeds. The foundation's work was specific. It supported small-scale agricultural producers in Mora County and the surrounding region, with a focus on heritage crops and traditional practices that were economically marginal but culturally and ecologically significant. The first grant went to the family growing the heritage rye. The second went to a Chile farmer in the lower county, whose variety was at risk of being abandoned for more commercially viable alternatives. The third went to a woman who had been preserving traditional acequia irrigation knowledge for 20 years with no institutional support, and had, in the absence of such support, simply continued doing it. The foundation was not announced with fanfare. It was mentioned briefly in the follow-up piece with Evelyn Marsh, in a paragraph near the end, that most readers probably did not reach. Marisol intended it this way. The foundation's work was not about being seen doing it. It was about the doing. The family situation resolved itself over time in the way that family situations tend to when the underlying power dynamic has shifted irrevocably, not through confrontation or formal reconciliation, but through the slow adjustment of positions to accommodate a reality that could no longer be avoided. Rodrigo's legal challenges ceased after Gabriel's second response letter. The cessation was not accompanied by any communication and was not acknowledged as a concession. It simply stopped, some of the way weather stops, without explanation or apology. Rodrigo and his wife came to the property once, in the second year, unannounced. She was in the distillery when they arrived and came out to meet them in the yard. The conversation was brief and almost entirely about the building. Rodrigo asked questions about the restoration, about the equipment, about the license. His wife said the sign looked good. They left after 40 minutes, and Marisol returned to the distillery, and that was that. Her father came the following spring, also once. He called ahead, which she appreciated. He arrived in the late afternoon, and she showed him the distillery, the way she had shown Theo Abramson, directly, without preamble, letting the thing speak for itself. He walked the mash room in silence. He stopped in front of the shelves, which were empty now, except for the current inventory. The new batches, young and developing. Their tags in Valentina's handwriting, because they had agreed that the handwriting on new bottles should be Valentina's. A decision that her grandfather would have approved of, she thought, because he had always understood that a tradition was something you participated in rather than owned. Her father stood in front of those shelves for a long time. When he turned around, his face had the expression of a man who has understood something that required too much time to understand, and knows it. He always knew, her father said, not asking, saying. Yes, Marisol said. He always knew. There was a silence that had the particular quality of silences between parents and children, when the thing being understood is too large and too old to be addressed directly. A silence full of everything that should have been said in other years, under other circumstances, and couldn't be retrieved, but could be, in some small way, acknowledged. She made dinner. They ate at the kitchen table where the letter had waited for her, and where she had pressed her palms flat on the surface and breathed through the first wave of everything. Her father ate the pozole she had made from Patricia's recipe and said it was excellent. She said she thought so too. They talked about the foundation, about the heritage rye, about the Chile sourcing, about the distillery license, and what the regulatory process had involved. They talked about things that were present and real and did not require anyone to pretend that the past had been other than what it was. He left at 9 in the evening, and she stood on the portal and watched his headlights disappear down the county road. She felt the specific complex thing of people who have been wronged by someone who is also, in some fundamental register, their family, and who have made a kind of peace with that complexity, not by resolving it, but by deciding it doesn't have to resolve in order for life to proceed. It was not forgiveness in the simple sense. It was something more honest. The acknowledgement that some things don't become clean, and that you can be whole anyway. She went inside and washed the dishes, and made tea, and sat at the table with her grandfather's letter in front of her. She read it once more, the way she read it sometimes when she needed to hear him, which was different from the way she had read it the first time. Not searching for instruction or confirmation, but simply receiving the presence of a person who had loved her specifically and correctly, and had built her something that expressed, more eloquently than any conversation could have, what that love was made of. She sat with the letter for a while. Then she folded it and put it back in its envelope and set it under the small stone from the creek, which still sat on the kitchen table where she had found it, because some things deserved to stay where they were. 3 years after the morning she had driven up the county road in a borrowed car burning oil and seen the property appear around the curve as if the land had decided to reveal it all at once. The Vega Distillery released its first public offering of new production. It was small, 300 cases, which was all the first 3 years of careful distilling had produced at the scale she was working. The release was announced quietly in the trade press and on a simple website that Valentina had helped design, and it sold out in 11 hours. The reviews, when they came, were the kind that reflected something larger than opinion. Writers in the spirits press describing not just the whiskey, but the quality of attention they could taste in it, the specificity of place, the patience built into the production. One writer said it tasted like continuity. Another said it tasted like New Mexico, in the way that only things made by people who understood the land, rather than simply standing on it, could taste. A third, the writing for a publication that rarely used this kind of language, said it was the most honest bottle of American whiskey he had encountered in 20 years of professional tasting. Her grandfather would have read those reviews once, nodded once, and gone back to work. She did the same. The land continued to be the land. The cottonwood grew another ring. The creek ran clear in spring and quieter in fall, the way it always had, the way it would continue to regardless of what happened in the human registers of the property. Patricia Salazar's family planted their fields in the same sequence they had planted for 4 generations. The mountains held their snow where the snow belonged and released it when the time came. The mornings arrived before the birds, the way they always had, and the birds arrived before the light, and the light arrived before anyone had decided what the day would be. She still woke before the alarms. She still drank her coffee black at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the back of the property while the land came into itself in the morning. The distillery building was visible from this window, its tin roof catching the first light and holding it in that particular copper color she had always loved. The sign was more legible now. They had cleaned it in the second year without repainting it, because she wanted it to show its age honestly, the way things that have survived long enough to matter show their age. Vega. Large letters that had only become more themselves with time. She thought about her grandfather every morning in those first minutes of quiet, before the day began its demands. Not with grief, or at least not only with grief, but with the specific quality of gratitude that comes from having been loved in a way that prepared you for your life rather than protected you from it. He had not left her the distillery so that she would be safe. He had left it so that she would have a place from which to do the work she was built for. The distinction mattered. It was the difference between shelter and foundation, between being given something and being trusted with something. She understood in those morning minutes that the trust was the gift. The distillery, the inventory, the money, the land, the water rights, the sign, the ledgers, all of it was real and all of it mattered, but none of it was the thing. The thing was that he had looked at her, across all the years and all the distance, and all the ways that life had arranged itself to keep them from the closeness they might otherwise have had. And he had seen her clearly, and he had said, "This is for you. You are the one." 3 times in a legal document, in the careful handwriting of a man who understood that some statements required the commitment of repetition. She had been 20 years old with $43 and a future that looked like weather with no forecast. She was 23 now, and the weather had a name, and the name was hers. And the April morning was doing what April mornings on this property did, arriving with the specific combination of cool air and warming light that made the land look like something a person might describe as beautiful if they were trying to explain it to someone who had never stood in it. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup. She put on her jacket and her boots. New boots now. Good ones. Bought in the first month after the Phase 1 proceeds cleared. The first thing she had purchased for herself that was not strictly necessary. And that choice had seemed right in a way that was hard to articulate. But that had something to do with the difference between surviving and building. She went outside. The distillery building waited where it always waited, patient and purposeful, its windows unboarded now and reflecting the morning sky. She could hear faintly the sounds of the building coming to life, Valentina arriving early, the soft movement of preparation, the particular hum of a place that had work inside it, and knew it. She crossed the yard. She opened the door. The smell of grain and oak and the particular alchemical quality of a distillery in operation came to meet her, the way the smell of a place comes to meet you when the place is alive and you belong to it. She went to work. That is where she is now, in the work, on the land, building the thing that was built for her to continue. The distillery that her grandfather kept alive in secret for 20 years, while the world assumed it was finished, is running again, making whiskey from heritage grain grown 3 properties over. From Chile, cultivated by the families of this valley. I'm with records kept in a database that Valentina designed, and that mirrors, in its structure and its precision, the 12 handwritten ledgers in the cabinet in the mash room that are preserved now in acid-free archival cases, and that contain, in their careful columns of dates and barrel numbers and quantities, the complete evidence of a life lived with extraordinary attention to the quality of what it produced. The woman who was told the place was worthless and the work was finished stands in it every morning and makes something from it. The woman who was handed an envelope and shown the door at 20 years old owns the land and the water and the sign and everything the sign stands for. And she is building on all of it with the patience she learned from the man who chose her, and the discipline she built from everything that came before, and the specific clarity of someone who has learned to tell the difference between what she lives in and what she merely survives. Some things are not over when they appear to be finished. Some things are simply waiting for the right pair of hands and the right amount of patience and the specific courage required to open a door that everyone else assumed led nowhere. Behind that door, in a mash room in Mora County, New Mexico, $341 million worth of patience sat on shelves and waited for a girl who understood what the land was for. She came. She opened the door. She is still there. There is a particular kind of morning that comes in the high desert in late October, after the first hard frost has moved through and taken the last of the chamisa color with it, when the land settles into a stillness that is not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of completion. The cottonwood drops its leaves all at once in that season, or nearly all at once, the way it makes decisions, without deliberation, without the gradual negotiation that trees in wetter climates perform. One morning, the leaves are gold and moving in the wind. The next morning, they are on the ground, and the branches are bare, and the sky through them is a blue so clear and final that it looks like an argument for something. Marisol noticed this the 4th October she lived on the property. She was 23. She was standing at the kitchen window with her coffee the way she stood every morning, and the cottonwood had let go overnight. And she stood there longer than usual, not thinking about anything specifically, just receiving the fact of it. She had been doing that more in the 4th year, standing in the middle of ordinary moments and simply being inside them, without the forward lean of planning or the backward pull of accounting. She had spent the first 3 years in a state of continuous motion, which had been necessary and right, and which she did not regret. But the 4th year had arrived with a different quality, as if the work had found its rhythm and no longer required the same quality of vigilance that building something from almost nothing required. The distillery ran. The staff knew what they were doing. The foundation made its grants. The land was tended. Things were, in the word she had come to use privately, and with some caution, stable. Stability was not a word she had trusted for most of her life. She had grown up in the presence of its simulation, the appearance of settled things that were not settled, the performance of normalcy over foundations that were not what they claimed to be. She had learned early that what looked solid from the outside often had a door in it that opened on very little, and she had calibrated accordingly, keeping herself light enough to move quickly, not accumulating more than she could carry if she had to. The process of unlearning that calibration was slower than she had expected, and more interesting. It was not a single decision or a single moment of trust restored. It was a series of mornings like this one, mornings where she noticed that she was still standing in the same place she had been standing the morning before and the morning before that, and that the ground under her feet had not shifted, and that the building in the back was still there, and that the work was still the work, and that nothing required her to be ready to leave. She did not know exactly when she had stopped being ready to leave. She suspected it had happened incrementally, in the way that most significant internal changes happened. Not announced, not dramatic, simply present one day when she checked, and absent in the checking itself. She thought about that sometimes, about the version of herself that had arrived here in a borrowed car with $43 and an address on a piece of paper and a grief she had not been given the time to do properly. That version had been competent. She had been capable of the practical work of surviving and of the emotional work of not collapsing under what she was carrying. But she had been held together in the specific way of things under pressure, the integrity maintained, but the maintenance itself exhausting, requiring constant low-level attention in the way that holding a position requires more energy than simply standing. She was not held together that way anymore. Something had shifted in the architecture of it, quietly, over 3 years of mornings and work, and the particular slow medicine of a place that asked something real of her every day and returned something real in exchange. She was not held together. She was simply here. The distinction felt important in a way she was still finding language for. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup. She did not go outside immediately. Instead, she sat back down at the kitchen table and did something she had not done often in the years since she arrived. She sat without a list, without a task, without the forward organization of attention that had been, for so long, her primary mode of occupying time. She sat and thought about her grandfather. Not strategically, not in the way she thought about him when she was making decisions about the distillery, or the foundation, or the sequencing of the remaining auction tranches. Those thoughts had a direction to them, a purpose, a question at the center. This was different. This was simply his presence, arrived without prompting, moving through the kitchen the way it sometimes did in the early mornings, when the house was quiet and the light was the particular gray gold of first sun through old glass. She thought about his hands. She had thought about his hands many times since he died. So many times that the thought had worn a kind of groove in her, a path her mind returned to with the ease of returning to anything that has been visited often enough to know. But this morning, the thought of his hands produced something she had not felt before. Not grief, not exactly, or not only. Something more complex. Something that had the texture of grief and the texture of gratitude braided together so thoroughly that she could not find where one ended and the other began. He had built something for her, with those hands over 30 years, in secret, without applause, and without the knowledge of whether the person he was building it for would understand it, or want it, or be in a position to receive it. He had built it anyway. He had trusted, not blindly, she understood now, not naively, because he had been a man of precision and intention, and he had known her specifically and clearly. He had trusted the thing he knew about her to be enough, that she would see it, that she would know what it was for, that she would continue it. The weight of that trust had been, in the first year, almost too much to hold. She had felt it as pressure, the obligation of the chosen, the anxiety of the person to whom something extraordinary has been given and who cannot be certain they deserve it or are equal to it. She had felt, in the first year, the constant background hum of being measured against a standard she had not set, but was now responsible for meeting. That hum was gone now. She did not know precisely when it had gone. She suspected it had left gradually, as the work proved itself to be something she was genuinely capable of, not because the money had confirmed it, not because the auction results had validated it, but because the daily evidence of the distillery running properly, of the whiskey developing in the barrels, of the staff doing good work, of the land being cared for, had accumulated into a body of proof that did not require anyone else's endorsement to be real. She had earned the trust, not by being exceptional in the dramatic sense, but by showing up every morning and doing the work correctly and making decisions that she could defend on their own terms, and building something that was genuinely continuous with what came before, rather than simply adjacent to it. She had earned it the same way her grandfather had earned the right to be trusted with the work, by doing it, over time, without asking anyone to watch. The kitchen held the morning quiet around her. The letter was in its envelope under the small creek stone where she kept it. She did not take it out this morning. She did not need to read the words to have access to him. She had moved, somewhere in the 4th year, past the need for the document. He was present without it, in the building, in the ledgers, in the particular smell of the mash room on a cold morning, in the way the light hit the tin roof at 4 in the afternoon. She carried him in the way you carry people who have shaped you, not as weight exactly, but as orientation. As the direction that north is on a compass, you have stopped needing to check because you have internalized it. She thought about the word she had been returning to lately: continuity. The whiskey writer had used it in a review, said the new Vega rye tasted like continuity, and she had read the word and felt it land in her with a recognition that surprised her by its precision. That was what she was building, not a monument, not a recovery, not even a legacy in the formal sense. Continuity. The condition in which a thing that was interrupted can find its way back to its own forward motion without pretending the interruption did not happen. The Vega Distillery had been interrupted. Her grandfather's grief had interrupted it, and then his decision to continue privately had transformed the interruption into something else, a hidden continuation, an underground river that had kept flowing beneath the surface of a land that appeared dry. She had brought the river back above ground. What she was doing now was simply allowing it to flow in the open, in the direction it had always been moving, which was forward, which was toward something, which was the natural condition of things that are genuinely alive. She thought about whether she was genuinely alive in the way she meant that. She thought she was, more so than she had been, more fully and more continuously than the survival mode of her early 20s had allowed. She thought about what it felt like to be inside her own life, rather than managing it from a position of tactical remove. It felt, she decided, to like the difference between the smell of a place from outside and the smell of it from inside. Both real, different in quality. She got up and went to the window again. The cottonwood stood bare and unremarkable against the October sky. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the girl who had driven up this road 4 years ago with a borrowed car and an unknown grief and a future that had not yet shown her its shape. And she felt toward that girl something that was not quite pity, and not quite pride, and not quite tenderness, but that contained all three in some proportion she could not calculate. That girl had been capable. She had been doing the best she could with what she had. What she had not been enough. Not by the standards of a world that distributes resources according to logics that have nothing to do with merit or need or readiness. But she had been enough in herself. She had been, this was the word Marisol returned to, sufficient. Sufficient to receive what she was given. Sufficient to understand it. Sufficient to carry it forward. She had not believed that about herself when she arrived. She had done the work anyway, which was perhaps the more important thing. She thought about the morning of her 20th birthday, the suitcase handle scraping across the hallway floor, her father's hands around the coffee mug, the slow rotation of them, the studied absence of his gaze. Diane in the silk robe, the color of old cream. The $200 in the envelope. The $43 of her own. So she thought about those things, not with the quality of a wound being pressed, but with the quality of a thing being looked at clearly from a sufficient distance, sufficient being the word again. She had arrived at the distance that allows clarity without requiring coldness, the distance from which you can see what happened without needing it to have been other than it was. What had happened was that she had been failed by people who should have done better. That was the plain truth of it, and she had known it for a long time, but the knowing had previously had a charge to it, an electric quality that could be activated by the right kind of pressure, and that she had spent considerable energy managing so that it did not activate at inconvenient moments. The charge was gone now. What remained was simply the fact, clear, stable, or no longer requiring management. She did not know exactly what had discharged it. She thought it might have been her father's visit, the pozole dinner, the silence in the kitchen that had contained the acknowledgement of things without requiring their direct articulation. She thought it might have been the 4th year generally, the accumulation of mornings in which nothing terrible had happened, and the ground had stayed where it was. She thought it might have been the work, the specific, daily, honest work of making something from grain and water and time, which had a quality of ground truth to it that gradually extended itself by daily contact into the rest of how she experienced things. Or perhaps it was simply that she was 23 instead of 20, and the years had done what years do when you give them good material to work with. She had heard people say, at various points in her life, that time heals things. She had always found this formulation slightly dishonest, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Time did not do the work. You did the work, inside the time. The time was the medium, not the agent. What healed things was the specific quality of attention you brought to living inside the time you were given, and whether that attention was honest, and whether the life you were building with it was genuinely yours. Hers was genuinely hers. She knew that with the certainty of someone who had, for the first time in her adult life, built something from the ground rather than moved into something already constructed by others and made herself useful within its existing shape. The distillery was hers, the foundation was hers, the land was hers. The decisions about all of it were hers, made with good information and genuine values, and the particular accountability of someone who cannot blame anyone else when the wrong choice is made, because there is no one else to point to. That accountability was something she had wanted her whole life without knowing how to name it. She had spent years in situations where the decisions that governed her daily existence were made by other people according to logics she was not party to, and the not being party to had been a specific and consistent source of a low-grade despair that she had learned to carry so routinely she had almost stopped identifying it as despair. It had simply been the texture of things, the grain of the surface she was living on. The surface she was living on now had a different grain. It had the grain of a thing she had sanded herself, slowly, with attention, knowing what she was working toward. She became aware, sitting in the kitchen in October with the bare cottonwood outside the window, that she was happy. Not the performed happiness of someone demonstrating that things had worked out. Not the relief happiness of someone who had escaped something. A quieter thing. The happiness of someone who is where they intended to be, doing what they are for with the work in front of them and the ground under their feet, and the reasonable expectation that tomorrow morning they will wake up in the same place and do it again. She had not expected this, or she had expected something that looked like this from the outside, but felt different, more triumphant, perhaps, or more dramatic. She had imagined, in the abstract way you imagine things when you cannot yet see them, that arriving at a good life would feel like arriving, like crossing a threshold and knowing you had crossed it. It did not feel like that. It felt like continuing. It felt like the morning after the morning after the morning, not arrival, but the accumulation of days that were recognizably, genuinely, unperformatively hers. She thought that might be what her grandfather had meant in the last paragraph of his letter, when he had written about the land correcting itself, given enough time. He had not meant that the world would become just, or that bad things would be undone, or that the people who had failed her would receive some proportionate consequence. He had meant something more specific and more true, that if she gave it time, and if she did the work, and if she stayed honest about what she was building and why, life had a tendency to find its level. Not perfectly, not without loss, not without the permanent marks left by what had been hard, but genuinely, and in a way that the person living it could recognize as real. She could recognize it. It was real. The evidence was specific and present, and did not require anyone else's confirmation. The distillery running in the building outside, the heritage rye in the barrels, Valentina's handwriting on the new tags, Patricia Salazar's field visible across the fence line in the particular gold of late October, the letter under the small stone, the water in the creek moving south the way it had moved for longer than anyone had records for. Outside, the first sounds of the distillery starting its morning came to her through the kitchen wall. The low hum of equipment, the soft movement of Valentina beginning her day. Marisol sat with those sounds for a moment, receiving them the way she received the mornings. Now. Fully, without the forward lean. Then she stood. She put on her jacket. She put on the good boots. She went to the door and opened it. And the October air came in with its particular combination of cold and clarity, carrying the smell of the land in its winter preparation, on the specific quality of a place settling into itself for the long, cold months with the patience of something that has done this many times and intends to do it many times more. She crossed the yard. The cottonwood stood bare above her. The distillery building received the first horizontal light of morning on its tin roof and held it there, copper and warm, the same color it had always been. She put her hand on the door. She felt the wood under her palm, the specific solidity of old timber that has dried slowly over many decades, and reached the density of something that has decided to stay. She felt the cold of the metal handle. She felt the ground under her feet, the high desert floor of Mora County, the same earth her grandfather had walked for 30 years in the dark, making something the world was not yet ready for. She understood something, standing there with her hand on the door in the October morning, that she had been moving toward for 4 years without knowing it was where she was going. She understood that being chosen, being seen specifically, being loved with enough clarity to be left the right thing rather than the comfortable thing, was not a gift you received and then possessed. It was an ongoing condition. It was a thing you had to continue to be worthy of, not through striving or anxiety, but through the daily practice of doing the work honestly and showing up for the land and the people on it and the thing you were making with the same quality of attention that had been given to you. Her grandfather had given her everything. She understood that now, with a completeness she had not had before, not just the inventory and the land and the money and the legal protections, but the larger thing underneath all of those, the demonstration of what it looked like to build something with genuine care over a long time, to maintain the quality of attention through seasons when no one was watching and no reward was coming, to trust the work itself as the measure rather than any external validation of it. He had shown her what that looked like. He had spent 30 years showing her before she even knew she was watching. She opened the door. The smell of the distillery came to meet her, grain and oak and the deep mineral undertone of the stone floor, and beneath all of those, the particular quality she had come to understand as the smell of transformation itself, and of a raw material in the process of becoming something it could not be without time and heat and care. She breathed it in. She went to work. She carried him with her, the way she carried him every morning, not as grief, not as obligation, not as the weight of being chosen, as direction, as the north on a compass she had internalized so completely she had stopped needing to check it. She knew where she was going. She had always known, which was, perhaps, what he had understood about her when he wrote her name 3 times in the document, that she was the kind of person who, once she knew where she was going, would simply go. She was still going. She would keep going. The work was in front of her, honest and specific and genuinely hers, and the morning was here, and the land was solid under her feet. And somewhere in the barrels aging in the back of the building was the next thing the world was not yet ready for. She was patient. She had learned patience from the best possible teacher. She would wait. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.